their own margin that they'll work at. And I think, again, going back to that point, as long as you're willing to explain it and be transparent in what you're doing, and people then have that ability to use that information to make their own choices, that's the important thing. It's when people start hiding away from what they're doing, or not having good reason to explain it, or being lazy and just using chemicals to solve problems when they're not that great, which is the easy thing to do, rather than working hard and putting in strong principles. So I think each their own.
Yeah. The next thing I wanted to ask you was, could you, before we sort of work into the wines, could you maybe give us a picture of 18 versus 19 in terms of the vintage and how it compared and what the results looked like for you?
Yeah, sure. Well, both are excellent years. I think we would consider in southern Victoria, and certainly in the Macedon Ranges where we are 50 k's northwest of Melbourne, and specifically at Bindi, that 18 is a vintage of absolute ease. Everything happened very easily through the year. There were no great ups or downs. The fruit set was really good. The summer was sort of warm to mild and long. And the wines express that. They're very balanced, very seamless wines, very silky smooth, and that harmony ensures they age really well. Whereas 19 was incredibly different. We had this incredible roller coaster of difficult and challenging weather, but ultimately at the critical times that we needed great weather to be on our side, we got these really stable or interesting patterns. So in 19 we had incredibly dry spring. Finished to winter was very dry. Spring was very dry. So great concern about lots of frosts, or about lack of growth going through the spring, and then difficult summer to follow. But then midway through spring, we just had incredible rainfall. So the weather was warm, and then we had amazing rainfall. So the vines grew impressively through mid to late spring and sort of saved that problem that we thought we were facing of difficult vigor. And then we went into the hottest, driest summer ever recorded. So we thought, oh, here we go. This is going to be shattering. But what had occurred with this fantastic mid to end spring was the vines were so strong and so resilient, and the subsoil moisture was pretty good. We sort of powered through the summer unaffected. And then when we thought, gee, this is going to be too hot and too dry if it continues on through the autumn, we got to March, the start of autumn, and the season completely changed. We didn't have this sort of end to summer, fragile sort of entry to autumn. We went into a beautiful, stable autumn, and we actually picked over the longest time frame ever for us, 17 days. And our vineyards just surround the house and the winery. They're all within about 700 meters of the winery for Bindi. And we picked over 17 days, which was an incredible long time for us. Normally it's like 3 or 4 or 5 days. And we just had this incredible, gentle, slow ripening through the autumn. And we consider 19 to be an outstanding year where there's power in the wines because of that hot, powerful summer. But there's a lot of freshness and balance and purity and delicacy because the autumn, when we were sort of finishing the ripening and we were harvesting, was very stable. So I think 19 sort of goes down as one of the highest quality vintages experienced in southern Victoria for Pinot Noir in particular. And 18 goes down as a beautifully balanced, reasonably prolific vintage, great delicacy and harmony.
Well, we'll probably circle back to that a little bit at the end when we look at the Dixon and the Block 5 and the original, because there's Suckling highlights very specific characteristics of those three that are expressive of, one being particularly lacy and aromatic, another one being very profoundly forward and quite demanding in terms of fruit, demanding of attention, in terms of its fruit presence. But overall, Suckling, I think the words he uses was one of the greatest vintages ever for Bindi. Is
that right?
He's very exciting. I was reading some of the notes that he put out recently.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's kick things off and maybe look at the two whites together, the Costas and the Ports. So everyone, Costas is 1 and Quartz is 2.
So the really important thing to understand with these two wines side by side is that the two wines come from two blocks joined next to each other and two clones of Chardonnay planted in 1988. So they were 31-year-old vines for the 19s. But the wines are not divided as per the blocks or the clones. Both of the wines incorporate both blocks and both clones. And the difference is actually a line that goes across the vineyards, and that is determined by the soil profile. So the lower 2/3 of our Chardonnay plantings is 5 million year old volcanic soil over clay. And as you come up the slope into the quartz area, which is 1/3 of this section planted in 1988, it's 480 million year old mudstone, sandstone, quartz rock over clay. So within about 10 steps, you change up a slight gradient, and you look at the soil and it changes significantly. And we've excavated, dug down to 1.5 meters and seen in the soil where this change occurs. And in fact, in 10 meters, 10 steps, you travel 475 million years in age in soil profiles. And when we planted the vineyard, like our family have been here for 60 odd years on this particular farm, and we've had the vineyard for just over 30. That it was an open north-facing slope, moderately free draining and relatively frost-free, and we planted it because it had these advantages of slope and north-facing aspect. But we didn't understand the significance of the soil profiles. We'd not really investigated that substantially. And it was actually the vines at about 7 years of age that told us there were differences there, in that we started to observe a slightly more open canopy further up the hill on the old stony soil, and quite a more vigorous canopy lower down, which makes sense, doesn't it? If you've got more volcanic soil lower down, which has got more fertility, therefore the vines are going to be stronger. You're going to have more lush vines. You're going to have a slightly higher crop level. The bunches are slightly larger. The berries are slightly larger. The ripening is slightly slower. And conversely, you come up the hill and all those things change, purely borne by the soil. And so we started to make the wine separately. We started to keep the fruit separate in 1995. And again, same clones, same rows, same planting year, just different soils, and made the wines the same. And lo and behold, the wines have got the difference. And the difference I always find,
it's amazing. The difference is profound.
Well, the difference is, I think the Costas has this more fruit forward sort of flamboyance, but the quartz has this core and tightness and minerality and drive and structure. And it's purely
chalkiness. Maybe there's a certain in my mid palate. There's that kind of grip, chalky grip, which I think is totally addictive. It's amazing.
And the quartz always takes probably 4 or 5 years to really unravel. So often for the first 2, 3, 4 years in bottle, the Costas, to my mind, drinks better. Like I often drink it and go, oh, this is more pleasing. And then at about 4, 5 or 6 years of age, there's this swap. And certainly at 8 or 10 years of age, there's no doubt, there's the volume and power of the quartz and the complexity, but often it's quite tight. And the beauty is they're grown the same way, made the same way, same clones, same climate, because that's same area. The difference is the soil.
There's a wonderful purity and precision in the quartz. That acid just promises years and years and years of development. It's very narrow now, but you can see exactly, and quite very linear. You can see exactly where it's headed. It's really exciting. I was actually looking at our inventory. It appears that we have about 5 different years of the Costas in our inventory at the moment. So at some point, I'm going to invite you to come back and work through those with us. It'd be fantastic. I think we've got
that'd be fun.
We've got from 14 to 19, just so happens, just bits and pieces. And so I'll talk to you guys about it. It'd be wonderful to see that progression with Costas as to how it looks as it gets older and loses that maybe prime, very lemon kind of character, and where it goes over time. That would be really very, very interesting to see. I think maybe in the quartz, less so now, but if I'm thinking back to other vintages of quartz, that white flower phenolic seemed to be something that was almost a house. It seemed to show itself all the way through in the releases. I've never been lucky enough to taste later cellared versions of the quartz. Does that stay all the way through? Is that something that you pick up, that you can still pick up in 5, 6, 7, 8 years time?
Definitely 5, 6, 7, 8 years time. But now when we look at the 2004, 5, 6 wines that get to that sort of 12 to 15 to 16 years of age, that drops away, and you start to get more honeyed characters. But you still get the citrus, the grapefruit coming through at that age. A little bit of maybe a bit more orangey blossom character rather than that sort of pure white
Yeah.
flour. Yeah.
Got it. There's a question probably how the Costa, does it spend time in oak? Yes, it does, mate. I should have the last, actually, Michael to tell us how much time does the Costa spend in oak?
Yeah, the Costa spends 11 months in oak. So I'll just briefly run you through how we ferment those wines. So we bring the fruit in and we de-stem. A lot of people like to whole bunch press, but I actually like to de-stem and get a little bit of skin contact in the press, not sitting in a tub for hours or days, but just in the press for sort of 2, 3, 4 hours. And then we squeeze the juice and we go straight to barrel. So we don't do any homogenization of the juice in tank, settling it with enzymes and so forth. We go straight to barrel. So each barrel, in effect, is different. The barrels at the start of the grape receival have got very bright, clear juice, very green juice. And then as we press, we get darker colored juice as it's been sitting on the skins and oxidizing slowly. And then we add a little bit of sulfur dioxide in the barrel, and then we wait. We don't add any yeast or enzymes or nutrients or anything. We just add a little bit of sulfur, and then we wait. So the ambient yeast, the wild yeast, takes about 4 or 5 days to ferment. And then it ferments in some new barrels, some medium barrels, some really old barrels, and about 25% new. And we get all this texture from the solids in there. And then we let about 1/3 of the barrels go through malolactic. Probably takes about 3, 4, 5 months to go through. And then we add a little bit of sulfur to all the barrels, which stops any further malolactic. And then we leave the wine in barrel on all the solids, plus all the yeast leaves from fermentation. And then 11 months later, after the commencement, we take them out and filter them into bottle after homogenizing all the barrels together. So it's a very, very simple way of winemaking. It's probably quite risky in some regards in that we don't do all these sort of controlling things by homogenizing, by adding nutrients, by adding enzymes, by adding yeast and so forth. And we leave the wines in barrel on all these solids for a long time, which we can roll the dice on that, because at 500 meters above sea level with very bright, clean fruit and low yields from mature vines, there's a substance in the grapes that allows us to take this relatively sort of attentive but hands-off approach. And it's because of the intensity of the fruit that we can let them go with our eye on them and take this approach, which adds texture and nuance to the wines, but they've got this natural resilience where they have this preserved freshness and vitality.
There's certainly not a lot of evidence of that mallow in these wines.
No.
It's just pure sort of, particularly in the courts, I'm sort of having a bit of a romance with it tonight, but there's this kind of porcelain-like texture to the quartz that's just mind-blowing. It has a wonderful finesse about it and poise. Really.
So the key for us is to have faith in the vineyard site and the farming, and then our ability to make the right picking decision, and then have this way of caring for the fruit and then and the juice and then the wine that allows the good things to happen and the fruit to shine. So we like texture, we like complexity, we like intensity and drive and length, and we like ageability. But we like all that to happen in a very harmonious framework where you don't get to pull the wine apart and say, oh yeah, I can taste all the malolactic, oh I can taste all the sulfides of the leaves, oh I can taste the alcohol, or I can taste all these things that can be done to Chardonnay. Or I can taste the batonnage, or I can taste the oxidative handling. We just like people to be able to taste the beauty of the wine with the sort of nuance and texture through it without it showing all of the technique there.
Maybe we should wander on to the Pinots next. So guys, the original is number 3. Am I right? Yes. And the Dixon's number 4. So the original is 98 points from Mr. Suckling, and your oldest vines. So again, 31 years. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And that's the first planting, obviously, that we did. It's a 2-acre, slightly less than 1 hectare site on this old stony soil. But it's a really particularly interesting spot, the original vineyard, where some of the volcanic soil has washed down very evenly over this ancient old stony soil. And the original vineyard probably would be the most even of the terroir of the vineyard sites that we have, where the soil doesn't change really through that site. So every vine has a very similar trunk width. Every vine's canopy is very similar, and bunch size is similar. And we've always seen that in the wine. It's such a balanced wine, very smooth, got lovely structure. But it's the sort of harmony we see in the soil is the harmony we see in the vines, and I think that flows through into the wine. It's sort of our most even-handed, fine-boned wine. And the interesting one though is in 2019, because the power of this vintage, it's an incredibly deep and layered original vineyard.
Sorry, carry on.
I'm just saying I'm used to seeing that, say, in 2018, 17, 15 to a degree, and so forth, having more red fruit and silky fine fragrance. But in 2009, it's like a bit dialed up and a bit more turbocharged, and that's just the nature of that very powerful season.
Yeah, it was interesting opening all of these earlier today, because the original was the most expressive on opening, just in terms of the 6 bottles that we opened. And then it's interesting now, I'm seeing, mine have been open since maybe Hoppers 5 or something for the second time. And that fruit forward characteristic of the Dixon is now definitely coming out.
Yes.
And it's now playing the game, whereas the original, there's this incredible depth. I haven't tasted them yet, but certainly just on the phenolics, there's this almost unfathomable depth to the phenolics of the original. You can see why, that extra vine age and just sheer class of the original really comes into play.
I think what we still do see really emphatically in that wine is the tannin profile. It's always very fine-boned tannin, and it's, whilst 19's got more a richness of tannin, but it's still really fine. And you'll see in Block 5 it's a bit more chewy, and you'll see in Dixon it's probably a little bit more rustic. But I think the tannin flow of the original vineyard.
Tasting it now, it's just this undulating, seamless smoothness. It's really, I can't say enough about the tannic structure of the wine, the textural, the way it sits in the palate. And having tasted many of these, my experience of your wines have not, until we do these retrospective things with you later in the year, hopefully, I've never really had a chance to see these at a time when they have aged. And so my memories of the original over the last sort of 8 vintages, I'm tasting it just as it's released. And this one is so much more developed already. And the tannins are so just subtler for me at this stage in the game. When I think back to the 15, 16, 17s, etc., it's really exciting, and to see just what this one's done relative to the others at similar early stages.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the 1998, which was a really great year for us. But it was slightly warmer than the preceding years. 1998 was our 8th vintage, 8th crop at Bindi. And so we had some level of vine age that we were confident in. But those wines have aged really well. And I think the balance is the key. It's Pinot Noir. So it's got this immediate drinkability and beauty. But I think it's the harmony with that structure that will ensure it lives for a very long time. But it's pretty damn pleasing at the moment. It's
amazing. I mean, that mid palate is the money shot for me. It's just so poised, and you have the sense of layering and perspective in the wine. The length is not there yet, and that's understandable just for something that's so young still. But wow, that mid palate is just playing to the back row for sure. It's wonderful. Suckling speaks a lot about orange. He picks it up in the Block 5 and the original. I personally am not seeing that tonight. For me, it's more of the sort of red cherry, the ripe cherry, and a certain spiciness in the wine, which I'm really attracted to, that savory, spicy component to it. I think it's really gorgeous. So maybe let's have a look at that Dixon now. So if I understand your harvest notes, it's all destemmed, the Dixon?
Yeah, 95%. So we throw a couple of buckets of whole bunch on the bottom, maybe 5%. In a normal year, like 9 years out of 10, that's what we do. Every now and again, we'll get a really cool year like 2011 and 2020, where I just don't bother with any whole bunch at all. But what we do is we take the rollers out of play on the destemmer. So the berries come off the stem and then drop down into the fermenting vat. So we get a lot of in-berry fermentation, which gives that extra aromatic
A
lift.
different kind of character, really. It's adding something new to it.
Yeah, that's a bit of fruitiness. And we work the vats quite gently. So we try to keep a lot of those berries intact for as long as we can. I'm also not a great fan of stemminess. I mean, it certainly works very well for lots of people, and there are years where it can be advantageous. But what we find where we are at the altitude that we have, 500 meters, plus these old stony soils in the southerly Victorian disposition, we get lots of aromatics in the wine anyway. We're not chasing extra fragrance or extra sinewyiness. So we find our wines have got plenty of perfume and vibrancy. They've got plenty of structure and matter. So we're not trying to derive that through the use of stems. The interesting thing with the Dixon is it comes from two sites on our property, and there's about 300 meters between those two sites, and one of them is lower down on more volcanic soil over clay, 30% from an original planting back in 1988, and the other 70% comes from the K vineyard, which is much more elevated and has a lot of mudstone in it. So a major component of Dixon has this mudstone, sandstone in it, which gives a bit of grip. But this part of that vineyard tends to give a lot of this boisterous fruit character, and it's always our most sort of fruit forward. This is sort of sounds disparaging, but least complex. You see in the original vineyard in Block 5, there's sort of more layers going down. Whereas Dixon, this gives you pleasure. It gives you definitive Pinot, Pinot Noir, hedonism, fruitiness, fragrance, and silkiness. But because of the 70% from the K vineyard, it also gives you sinewy tannin and structural elements that are really good for aging.
Yeah, I'm kind of reaching for a Berg reference, which is a bit silly of me. I'm constantly trying to, and for me, the Dixon seems to echo a little bit what I know of Pommard in terms of that immediacy and fruit voluptuous kind of aspect to it. But certainly in time, you're going to see more layering in that Dixon, won't you? It's going to round and deepen, won't it?
No doubt, and it's almost a disarming wine because it looks so fruity and succulent when it's young. But we found that the wines at 10, 12, 15 years of age are quite beautiful. If you look at the 2006 or 8 or 2009 today, you go, wow, this wine is just at its peak now. There's still primary sweetness of fruit. Plus we're getting those undergrowth characters coming in, in that deeper autumnal complexity. And that generally takes with these wines 7 to 8 to 10 years to truly come in. And what we found, that first Pinot we made was 1992. The first Chardonnay was 91. And we found that we're making these 92 Pinots, 93, 94, that they had this lovely fruit forward character and balance. So we'd constantly say to people, drink it up in the next couple of years. It's a young vine, Pinot Noir. And earlier this year, we had a 1993 original vineyard that was beautiful, sweet fruit, spicy, vigorous acidity. And, there was no excuse to be made to say, not bad for an old wine. It was like, wow, what a beautiful wine with life and deliciousness. And we had no expectation of that. So we spent 20 years telling people to drink that wine up in the next 1 or 2 years. And then we gave up. So what we found was that they'd take about 5 to 7 years to get up onto a plateau. And then they would sit there for a long time. And they they don't do this sort of up and over and down. They just sit up on the plateau and just keep going. And what we've found now is with different vineyard sites, Block 5 and original vineyard, there's a couple of new wines coming on stream in the next couple of years from some high density plantings that we've done, is we've learned that the vineyard site then sets the agenda, because we do all the farming in the same way and all the winemaking in the same way. The vineyard site sets the agenda as to when it gets up onto its plateau. So Block 5 takes longer to get up onto that best drinking window plateau. An original vineyard does it a bit earlier, and Dixon does it a bit earlier, but they all seem to sit there for at least 15 years drinking really well. And then it becomes a personal issue as to what is your favorite time to drink within that window. Mine tends to be about 7 to 10 years. I think I really love the primary characters of Pinot Noir, but I really love it when they start to settle down and show further nuance and texture.
Yeah, when they start changing gear into second and third, it's just so beautiful, right? I mean, just that nexus of primary and secondary maturation is such an exciting time in Pinot.
It really is.
Yeah. So at that point, let's have a look at your block 5. So really interesting, and again, I'll sort of keep referencing Suckling, but I'm really enthused by the way he writes about your wines for this vintage. He now contrasts your orange, your original. I think the reference he used was Chambertin. He sort of speaks about it in that context, which is really interesting. But here in the block 5, he speaks more about lacy delicacy in the wine, which is so completely different. So could you maybe share that with us a little bit?
Well, I think this is the quirky thing about the 19 vintage. It's almost flipped the two wines on their heads a little bit, because for us, the original vineyard generally shows more fragrance and red fruit and silkiness, and block 5 always is more mineral, more restrained when young, darker fruit profile, more ferrous and vigorous and structured and shy. Whereas in 19, the block 5 shows beautiful perfume, shows some hints of red fruit, and shows an immediate beauty. Whereas original vineyard's got that darker, denser characteristic going on. 19. But I think where we definitely see both vineyards true to form is on the palate, and we see the fine rolling tannin in original vineyard, but you get at block 5 19 and you feel the tension in the wine, you feel the structure, the vigor of tannin, you feel that tightness and drive, and that's certainly the hallmark of that wine. I'm really happy with the block 5 19. I think it sits in a spot.
Oh, it's amazing. And again, you're absolutely you're on the money with this issue about it. The characteristics seem to have done a 180. Because in previous years, again, looking at them recently bottled, the 5 doesn't manifest the sort of lacy sort of fragility, which is really beautiful right now. How do you feel about where that's going to go in terms of cellaring? Is that a characteristic that's going to stay in the wine in the next 10 years? Is that something that's going to remain as a character?
That beauty will definitely stay there. But what it's going to do is just build more density and power, sort of fill out around that core. It's almost a bit like you picture a base wine in champagne, where it starts off with this tight core, and then it just builds texture and weight around it, but it keeps that drive. I think 19 block 5's got a 15 to 20 year future.
Amazing.
It reminds me a little bit of the 97 block 5, which was the second wine made from that vineyard, which was a really beautifully red fruited but flamboyant wine, which is gorgeous today. I mean, it's 23 years old today, but I don't have any hurry drinking 97 block 5. We just sort of drink a bottle every couple of years and just leave them go. They just live for an enormously long time.
So in terms of the soil in the block 5, volcanic lava seems to be something that's dry, that is a predominant feature in the soil. And the other thing I've noticed that it's only half a hectare. What is the density of plantings? I wanted to ask you about just what your approach is with that.
I'll start with the soil profile, then go to the density. So I spoke a little bit before about original vineyard, how even it is through the site. Block 5 is really different. It's further up the hill and it's a steeper vineyard. And the top part of block 5 has a lot of the old Ordovician mudstone, quartz rock and clay in it. And the top half of block 5 is a very strong place, but hard for the vines to grow. And the berry size up there is much smaller than the bottom half of block 5, which it runs down with this old ancient soil, but it goes down to an old creek line. And above that ancient soil, which is prevalent at the top of the surface, at the top of block 5, it goes down, and then in the bottom of the block 5, there's the volcanic soil washed down and built up over that old soil. So the bottom part of block 5 creates more vigor, more juiciness in the berries, and a more fruity, flamboyant component. And the top part of block 5, where the skin to juice ratio is much higher, the vines struggle more, has this real drive and tightness and gives that austerity and structure to the wine. So it's quite contrasting to original vineyard, which is sort of one complete consistent site.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think we always see these two things in Block 5, very compatible things, but it really distinguishes itself in that regard. Going to planting density, all of our vineyards planted from 1998 to 2001 are at 2,500 vines per hectare. So it means 3 meters wide rows, about 1.2 meters between vines. And they're typically cropped at about 1.5 to 2 kilos per vine, which gives, in European terms, they would say 35 hectolitres per hectare.
Yeah.
And the subsequent plantings we've done, one vineyard right alongside Block 5 on the same sweep around the land at the same elevation, called Block 8, is planted at 11,300 vines per hectare. So, 4.5 times more vines per hectare rate, but still asking for 35 hectolitres per hectare or below, just a lot more vines to do it. And we planted another vineyard on the other side of the winery called Darshan, and that again is 11,000 plus vines per hectare. But what we ask there is for about 300 or 400 or 500 grams per vine, as opposed to 1.5 to 2 kilos. And there's this really.
What are you getting there, Mike? Are you getting, like, with the Darshan, are you getting profound intensity? Because Jeremy Oliver speaks about your Darshan. We're not going to get it here for another 2 years. It's like
we're not releasing any of them until we've made another couple of vintages. So we've made 4 vintages so far, and we're going to make a few more before we start to release.
Because Jeremy writes about your Darshan as being one of the 12 most important innovations in the Australian wine industry today. It was a fantastic article that I read recently. And if I have the numbers right, what he said was it was something like 20,000 vines per hectare, and I that's just couldn't be possible.
Well, there's parts of both of these new vineyards which are 22,600 vines per hectare. It's very close and very small crop per vine, but it actually starts to become a bit perverse. You start to get these vines growing in such close proximity that it almost becomes a distortion. The crop is so fragile per vine, the competition is so dense, the humidity is so great, and we've done some little batch fermentations from these little parcels, and then blended it back into the wine from that vineyard at the 11,300 vines. But it's early days, but we're experimenting and playing. And I mean, it's nice of Jeremy to say that, but there's people who have had high density vineyards in Australia for a while, like Bannockburn have had some, and Bass Phillip have had some, and Diamond Valley, and there's a few others around.
I think there's the Tupre, which is around 11, if I have remember my numbers rightly from
and there's By Far as well. I guess for me the conversation comes down to understanding all the things that are incorporated in there, who's there, how long you've been doing it, how you go about it. Ultimately what it comes down to in regard to quality is the vineyard site. So are you farming an outstanding vineyard site? Because you can do all the same things on a lesser vineyard site. Like we see a great producer in say Vendromenay. If you're there in the village and you've got some Bourgogne Rouge on the other side of the N74 and farm it exactly the same way that you do in Les Souchaux or Beaumont or Richebourg, doing exactly the same thing won't give you the same result. And you can talk about how your density is and how you farmed and so forth, but it totally comes down to, as we understand, the quality of the vineyard site, all things being kept the same. So we're very comfortable in that we know Block 5 produces a certain quality and Quartz does and Original Vineyard does. And we know the terroir that we're dealing with, and we can look at a slope and go, is it a good one or not, based on 30 years of experience now. So we have a confidence that what we're seeing in the vineyards and in the barrels and now in the bottled wine is a progression of quality, and it's a logical progression. But we're very patient. We'll wait a few more years before we release. But certainly to this point, we're believing that we've taken another step or two of quality.
It's very exciting times for you. Hopefully by 2022 you can come and drink them with us here in Singapore. I think we should
I'd love to. We might be free to come and visit you by then.
I remember the last time you visited us would have been 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, I think it was 3 or 4.
We had a good night.
That was a great night.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, with Rishi.
That was great. Now we're moving towards Heathcote. I wanted to ask you the naming of the Perret Syrah. In some years, apparently, Bindi Heathcote Syrah, and some years it appears to be Bindi Perret Syrah. Is that just me taking wrong notice, or did you make a conscious change with
No, it's always been. In fact, we first made this wine in 2001 when a friend of ours had developed this new vineyard doing Shiraz 100 kilometers north of where we are, and we had the opportunity to play around with some of the fruit in their first vintage, which ripens about 4 to 5 weeks before our fruit does. So we can take the fruit from that vineyard up there, play around with it, have it in barrel before we even start taking our nets off to start harvesting. So it's been always a fun project. But from 01 to 03, it was called Bundalia, which was the name of the homestead our property at Bindi was part of, which my grandparents had. And then we had some legal issue with I think it's now a defunct label in South Australia. And so we ended up changing the name in 2005. And Perret is the name of a forest across the road from us. It's a very significant landscape and important environment. And so Perret is the name of the forest, and it's named after Pyrites, the fool's gold. So we always think of the Shiraz as like the fool's gold kind of wine. But it's always been called Perret. And I think the only area or way it says Bindi on the label is my email address on the back, which is michael@wines.au. So it's always called Perret, but you'll see it on various wine lists or listed for sale as Bindi Perret because the association, of course, with us because we make it. So for 20 years now, we've been buying the fruit from a mate of ours with this vineyard, and in fact now his vineyard manager's got his own vineyard, and we take a bit of fruit from there also for this. But they're both very fine farmers. And it's a really amazing area for Shiraz on this 500 million year old Cambrian era soil, low yield. It's not quite as low as Bindi. We're sort of 1.5 to 2 tons to the acre. These guys are more sort of 2.5 tons to the acre. And we make the wine pretty much the same way as we make the Pinot Noir, a little bit more whole bunch, but all French barrels, a lot of old barrels, 11 months in barrel. And the whole style is meant to be medium weight, fruity and savoury, but silky smooth. And Halliday.
That notion of silkiness really nails it for me because I'm thinking of the other Heathcote labels that I sort of drink a little bit of, the Duck Muck and the Mail Coach and the others. This one stands out texturally. There's this finesse at a very early stage, which is really glorious about it.
I think that comes about from probably 3 or 4 things. One is that we don't let the fruit hang out on the vine for a long, long time. So we get moderate alcohols, 13, 14, maximum 14.5, but typically about 13.5 to 14% alcohol. So there's not this real richness or warmth or power from alcohol. And then we ferment it with quite a few whole bunches or whole berries, mostly whole berries. But we don't push it hard. We don't macerate for a long time. We don't plunge and work it hard a lot. So we get this real delicacy of tannin coming through. And then the aging is straight into French oak, mostly old. So we're not layering it up with oak and oak tannin. And then the malolactic occurs in barrel, which I think is very important. And it softens the wine in barrel. And then it's just very clean, careful winemaking. One of the problems you can get with Shiraz is that it gets a bit reduced. It gets a bit sulphidey or a bit gamey. And we don't mind a little touch of that sometimes when it might first hit the glass. But we definitely don't want a wine that people look at and say, oh, it's very gamey or it's like, duck's guts or it's sulphidey. We're not looking for that level of complexity or winemaking artifice. So the whole thing is it's meant to be fragrant, berries, earth, harmony, and deliciousness.
I think in a blind tasting, I would be totally. There's no ways I'd pick Heathcote. The nuance and the elevation and the delicacy of it is not Heathcote. The Heathcote that I've kind of drunk before. It's really exciting to see this level of expression. It's beautiful.
What's happened with Heathcote in the last 10 years is there's a few different camps now. There's people making fabulous, very powerful, concentrated, dense, tannic, age-worthy wines. And then there's lots of what they call new wave producers who are picking a bit earlier, being quite gentle with the wines and making this more sort of delicious. And some people are using a lot of whole bunch, much more than we would use and wish to use. And there was an article last year someone wrote, I can't remember who wrote it, but might have been Max Allen actually. but talking about this new wave, and they were saying, oh, the first people to do it were us 20 years ago. And I was like going, all we were trying to do was make wine that we wanted to drink. We're a poor old Pinot Noir winemakers, trying to look for balance and silkiness and creaminess and brightness and freshness. And we weren't trying to start anything or create anything. There's been quite a few people who have now gone down that style. And obviously we see in Australia and around the world a movement to lower alcohol wines in many areas, and not working wines as much, not wanting them to look alcoholic or look oaky, or look like they've had a lot of tartaric acid embedded in them and that sort of stuff. And that's never ever been our intention, is to make a particular style that can be identified with. It's always been just about making something that we like to drink that's delicious.
Well, I wonder if the accolade can't be given to you on the basis that you're obviously a Pinot expert, and maybe your Pinot winemaking sensibilities in a different genre, Syrah, have played incredibly well, and it shows nuance and caliber that you just don't see in some of the other examples from that region. I think it's a real win. And if I remember correctly, I don't remember the price of this, but it's not particularly expensive wine relative to what else Heathcote costs for Syrah. I think it's a really, really terrific example of just something that's quiet and calm and balanced. You're not,
yes,
it's just not raging against the storm. And that's always something that I always default to when it comes to Heathcote, this big sort of muscular, profound kind of flavor.
Yeah, and there's room for everything, and I guess it depends on who you are and what your occasion is. One of the wonderful things about making this wine is that, having had the level of success we have with Bindi, we have this sort of robust vehicle driving us along, and we have the opportunity to make a wine like this, where we certainly want it to be profitable, and it is, but it doesn't need to be ramped up to a high price. Because we have all these costs covered by what we do, and the fruit cost and all there's barrel cost and bottle cost and so forth. But it's really lovely, because I often feel a sort of level of guilt that our wines are so expensive. The higher you go up in our, the high density wines, which are super expensive to set up and run, will be expensive. I just love the opportunity to make something that is beautiful, that does have our philosophy and sensibilities around it, that is not super expensive.
I think it's a real win. I'd like to write a bit more about this, actually. I'm delighted that we looked at it tonight. I actually said to Lou, as usual, I was wrong about these things. I said, no, I just want to look at the Pinot and the Chardonnay. He said, no, bollocks, you've got to see it all. And I'm really glad that we did this, because it actually it shows a house style in a different part of the world. And I'm really excited with it. Michael, before we sorry.
Can I just add one thing to that? It's been a really successful wine for us in restaurants in Australia, and a lot of sommeliers, and I know a lot of the sommeliers set around the country who've been great supporters of our Pinots. They enjoy selling it to tables where there was almost an argument about whether we're having a Shiraz or a Pinot. And they'll say, we'll have a try of this wine, because it will give you creaminess and freshness and brightness and that delicious, easy character. But there is a bit more darkness and richness and earthiness, of course, there is than Pinots would have. And it kind of plays a little bit of both games.
Fantastic, amazing. There's a question from Byron. What's the inspiration between the high density experiment? He's saying Olivier Lame is his...
No, it's more... I've read things going back a long time. I mean, Olivier Lame is an incredibly inspiring producer who is doing some super high density. I looked at his vineyard in Crio about 10 years ago. But many years before that, when I was in Burgundy and also talking with some winemaking mentors of mine, going even back before that to the early 90s, I'd heard and read about these old vineyards before tractors were put through them. And even before horses, where they were all managed by hand. And vineyards might be 20, 30, 40,000 vines, and they were individual vines. And then things were lined up to make them more mechanized and formal. And I sort of thought, that's interesting. And having worked through the Rhone Valley, in 1995, I spent time 3 or 4 weeks working with Alain Graillot in Crozes Hermitage, but spent a lot of time visiting other growers, walking up and down the hill of Hermitage and going to Côte Rôtie with the Gigals and Jasmin and these sort of people, and saw vineyards very closely planted, and they'd be talking about, very micro yields per plant. So it's not even necessarily just about a Burgundian thing, about having lots of vines in a small space. And it's not just necessarily about a conversation in France, but talking to people who had studied that. And I guess the key person for me to really talk about is Stuart Anderson, my winemaking mentor, who taught me how to make wine back in the 1991 to 97. He started up Balgownie Winery back in the late 60s. But Stuart used to go and travel to France and make a lot of vintages, but he's also a great scholar of wine. So I'd be working alongside Stuart as this 22-year-old, 23-year-old kid learning about making wine. And we had the vineyard here, but we hadn't made any crops really, just a couple of small ones. And Stuart would tell me stories about farming and making wine in Burgundy and what the old monks did back, because he was a great scholar of wine. So all these ideas were percolating and embedded, and then, went to Champagne and worked there in 95 and spent a lot of time in Burgundy and then subsequent visits as well. But so I wouldn't say there's any light bulb moment, but there's a whole lot of moments that occurred over many decades to think that was an interesting way of farming.
Yeah, really interesting. Any other questions from anybody else before we say goodnight to Michael? Nobody else? Well, Michael, thanks so much for your time. It's been really insightful and really exciting to taste these at this early stage. And I'm really looking forward to having you back online with us soon, so we can look at those costas and a couple of other things. Thanks once again for joining us. Everybody, remember to save your glass jars. They're worth $1.50 if you get them back to us with your next delivery, saving the planet. And I'll send a copy of this recording out to everyone tomorrow with access to the wines. I haven't done a general offering to the database yet, so you guys will get the offering ahead of the general database. So Michael, once again, thanks so much for coming, and it's been terrific to share these with you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Robert. Thanks everyone for coming along, so to speak, tonight, and thanks to Greg for facilitating our wines through to Singapore. It's very much appreciated. Thank you.
All right. Take it easy. We'll see you soon.
Okay. Bye.
Cheers. Good night.
Good night.
Damn, that Syrah is nice.
That was amazing. Very good, Robert.
Oh, it was fantastic to speak.